tarde a todos e a todas. Gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos vocês aqui nessa tarde de primavera já? Primavera, né? Para mais um evento do nosso ciclo de palestras. E gostaria de agradecer também a presença dos nossos dois palestrantes de hoje. A gente vai ter uma palestra em dupla de Duncan McDonnell e Sofia Ammassari, ambos do Griffith University, na Austrália. O nome da palestra é The Rise of Transnational Populist Radical Right. Rapidamente, o professor Duncan McDonnell é professor da Escola de Governo e Relações Internacionais da Griffith University, em Brisbane, na Austrália. É pesquisador também do Conselho Australiano de Pesquisa, imagino que seja algum tipo de CNPq de lá. E coautor com Annika Werner do livro International Populism, the Radical Right in the European Parliament, que saiu pela Oxford University Press em 2020. A próxima publicação planejada dele, segundo aqui estou lendo, chama-se Youth Wings of the Populist Radical Right, vai sair em 2026. Eu acho colaboração com a Sofia e mais outros autores, inclusive o nosso amigo Cas Mudde, que já esteve aqui anteriormente também, falando dessa mesma mesa. I'm sorry.
He's already been here?
He's been here, yeah, on the same table.
All right.
E Sofia Ammassari, doutora em Ciência Política pela Escola de Governo e Relações Internacionais, também da Griffith University, pesquisadora da mesma instituição, é autora do artigo Men's Parties but with More Active Women, Gender and Party Activism in the Populist Radical Right, e também seu primeiro livro chama Grassroots, Women and the Populist Radical Right, e tem uma previsão de publicação para 2026, também pela Oxford University Press. Então, sem mais delongas, eu gostaria de passar a palavra para os nossos palestrantes de hoje, que vão fazer a apresentação em inglês. Okidoki?
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Sean, and thanks to all of you for coming here this afternoon. We appreciate you turning out to listen to us. We're going to be talking to you for the next 35, 40 minutes about a project Sofia and I have been working on for a few years now, which looks at the transnationalization of the populist radical right. What do we mean by that? We mean basically how parties and leaders of the populist radical right are increasingly cooperating internationally. Okay? And this is something new for those of us who've been around for a while. Once upon a time, these parties didn't used to do that. Now they do. Just maybe to begin, so that we're all clear about what and who we're talking about. Who are the radical right populists? Well, first of all, starting closer to home, there are people like Jair Bolsonaro, Javier Milei in Argentina. But this is very much a global phenomenon now. So it's also obviously people like Donald Trump, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, or Narendra Modi in India, or Marine Le Pen in France. And significantly, of course, in the last decade, 2 decades, these kinds of parties and leaders have gone from being quite marginal. I remember when I first started studying the Northern League, as it was called then in Italy, they were a party of 4%, and that was considered good. These days, these parties are in government, they're leading governments, they're very successful in the polls. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the populist radical right. And what is it? Just so we're clear from the beginning, what do we mean by that term? We conceive of populist radical right ideology as essentially saying something very, very simple. All radical right populists, whether they're Modi in India or Le Pen in France or Trump in the United States, are saying the following. They're saying there is a good, homogenous people who are attached to their traditions, their identity, their values, and this good moral people are cast as being under threat. They're under threat from above by a whole series of elites. They may be financial, they may be mainstream parties, it could be the media, judges, academics like us. We're all part of those bad elites. But the people are also under threat from below by a whole series of dangerous others. Immigrants, people of colour, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ people, and so on. Basically, any group that the populists can frame as being not of the people and a threat to the people. Okay, so that's the types of parties and leaders that we're talking about. Apart from this ideology, something else the populist radical right leaders and parties have in common, or used to have in common, is that they didn't used to cooperate with one another. Once upon a time, in places like the European Parliament, you had Greens sitting with Greens in the same group. You'd left-wing Social Democrats sitting with Social Democrats. You'd Christian Democrats with Christian Democrats. The odd kids out in the group were always the radical right. They didn't tend to sit with each other. They avoided each other. For multiple reasons. One, competing nationalism. Sometimes it's hard to get nationalists together, for obvious reasons. Personal animosities. But in particular, and I know it's from Joe mentioned the last book I did, International Populism, which we looked really at the reasons behind why they didn't used to cooperate in Europe. They were afraid of reputational damage. So if I'm a radical right party in one country, if I associate with someone like Le Pen or the AfD from Germany, I think, okay, I'm going to get killed in my domestic media for this kind of association. Okay? And that's continued on until relatively recently. So, for example, and not just in Europe. So, for example, on the screen, Donald Trump, when he was elected in 2016, they asked, well, you know, are you going to pursue closer ties with some of these European parties, like Le Pen, or like the German AfD, or the League in Italy? And he cut them short, saying, there's no common ground to be explored here. There's nothing to see. I have nothing to do with those people. Also within parts of Europe, in Eastern Europe, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, the most prominent radical right leaders in Europe, in 2019, he was asked, what about the chances of you, for example, allying with Le Pen in the European Parliament? And his answer was, I've nothing at all to do with Madame Le Pen. Nothing. Well, that's how it started, and this is how it's going. On your screen there, you see Viktor Orban very clearly having something to do with Marine Le Pen. They're now in the same group in the European Parliament, called Patriots for Europe. It's the third largest group in the European Parliament. There's two radical right groups in the European Parliament now. If you put them together, that would be the second largest group. Things have changed enormously. And it's not just in Europe. CPAC. 10 years ago, CPAC existed only in the United States. It was an event for US Republicans, and that was it. Now we have CPAC Brazil, I think has been 4 or 5 years going. We have CPAC in Australia. The last one was in our hometown, Brisbane, just a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, we missed it. You have CPACs in Japan. You have CPACs in Europe. You can see on the screen there, that's Kristi Noem, the US Secretary for Homeland Security. She was speaking at CPAC Hold, and that was the beginning of a very interesting week for the radical right in 2025. So in the last week of May, and this underlines how things have changed for radical right cooperation. Take the last week of May 2025. Monday and Tuesday was CPAC Hold. Bunch of US Republicans, polls from Law and Justice, some other Europeans. That went on for 2 days. It was then a day's break. And then on Thursday, you had CPAC Hungary. There were speakers from over 30 countries at CPAC Hungary, which gives an idea of the extent of the spread of the populist radical right. They were welcomed to Budapest by Viktor Orban. and they had 2 days of discussions, networking, and so on. When that was over, we then had this on the weekend in Budapest. Now this you won't have heard. If you have, you're a bigger nerd than me. This was the 5th edition of what's called the Transatlantic Young Patriots Summit. What this has done every year is to bring together, as they say on their banner, patriots, as they call themselves, from across the United States and Europe. So on the screen there, you have representatives of the youth wings, so the young movements, from the parties of the Austrian Freedom Party. The guy in the middle is a guy called Gavin Wax from the US Young Republicans. The guy on the far right is from Fidesz, the governing party of Hungary. He was the former leader of their youth wing. And the fun wasn't finished there in Hungary. A few weeks later, around the 10th of June, you had the 4th edition of the Foro Madrid, which is an initiative originally from the Spanish party Vox. That's the leader of Vox, Santiago Abascal, you can see on the screen, which brings together radical right populists from Latin America and from what they call the Iberosphere. This year it was in Asunción, Paraguay. Every year it's been held for the last 4 or 5 years. It's been held in a different South American capital. There were also speakers from Hungary and France at this as well. So, as I say, if you look back compared to 10 years ago, things have changed hugely. From not cooperating at all, radical right populists are now cooperating not just in places like the European Parliament, but globally. So in this talk today, we're going to look at 3 main questions. We're going to look, who are the main architects of this transnationalization process? We're going to ask, what are the key mobilizing issues for them? What are the issues that bring them together? And finally, we look at, well, why are they now cooperating transnationally? What is it that's driving this change in collaboration? So I'm going to hand over to Sofia now, who's going to bring you through the first 2 questions, and I'll be back for the last one.
Thanks, Annika. So, in order to answer our research question about the key mobilizing issues for the transnational populist radical right, we collected an original corpus of 320 speeches which were delivered in 4 types of transnational events between 2013 and 2024. So these events are first the congresses and rallies organized in the context of the European Parliament, so those organized by the 2 populist radical right European Parliament groups, Europe of Nations and Freedom, which is ENF there, and its successor, Identity and Democracy, whose acronym is ID. The second type of events we look at are CPAC Hungary, because as Duncan has mentioned, this has really become the central hub for the transnational populist radical right in terms of the amount of countries that are represented in it. But we also looked at speeches of international speakers going to US CPAC. So for example, when Bolsonaro went there, or the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni went to US CPAC, we also looked at those speeches. The third type of event are the national conservatism conferences. These are organized by a US think tank. They have been held since 2019 in Europe and the United States. And finally, we're going to look at the Viva festivals. These are organized by the Spanish populist radical right party Vox, and they have been held in Madrid since 2021, once a year. So we conducted both a quantitative analysis of the speeches using structural topic models. So these are models that enable us to find latent topics in a large collection of textual data. But we were also interested in whether, when these party actors address these topics, do they actually adopt the same narratives, the same frames? Do they actually talk about the same things when they go to these different types of events? So we also conducted a qualitative analysis on a selection of 32 speeches. And to answer the question about the drivers of transnationalization, we have conducted so far 20 interviews with elected representatives, think tank officials, and youth wing leaders from the States, Hungary, Italy, and Spain so far, and we are planning to conduct more interviews in the forthcoming weeks here in South America. Let us move on to our findings, starting from who are the main architects of the populist radical right, transnationalization. We have identified mainly three, of which Hungary is by far the most prominent and the most active. So the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has really cast himself as the leader of the transnational radical right in its fight against liberal elites. So in the past year, his party Fidesz has developed very strong links with the United States, for example, and this is most evident from the establishment of CPAC Hungary since 2022, which is organized by the Fidesz-affiliated think tank, the Center for Fundamental Rights. Not only Hungary has links with the United States, but also obviously it maintains its links with European populist radical right parties. So much so that just a few months ago, they have founded another European Parliament group for the populist radical right, which is called Patriots for Europe. And very interestingly, the Center for Fundamental Rights last year has opened an office in Madrid, and that enables Fidesz to collaborate more closely with the Spanish radical right party Vox and exploit its ties with Latin America. So Hungary is really active across continents, across three fronts, in order to pursue this transnationalization. The second main architect is Spain, and here in particular I'm talking about the party Vox and its affiliated think tank, Fundación Disenso. So in the past years, politicians from Vox have visited Latin America a lot in order to build links with like-minded politicians here. And the Viva festivals, which I was talking about earlier, are attended by the most prominent leaders of the populist radical right, both in Europe and from Latin America. So Milei was there, Eduardo Bolsonaro sent his video messages, Cast from Chile was there, and so on. And as Duncan has mentioned, most importantly, Vox has founded the Foro Madrid, which is this organization that should work as a counterweight to the Sao Paulo Forum, and whose main goal is really to fight against the threat of communism in Latin America. And the third main architect are the United States, and obviously their efforts towards transnationalization have been further fostered by the legitimacy that the success of Donald Trump gives to the populist radical right. And here we have organizations like the American Conservative Union, ACU, which organizes CPAC in the US, but now it's very happy to lend its brand and expertise to other countries like Brazil, who wants to organize CPAC. We have the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank whose members are always present at this kind of transnational events. And Heritage Foundation has also been organizing workshops with think tanks from other European countries in order to, train populist radical right politicians on a number of issues. And then we have the Young Republicans, which are the youth wing of the US Republican Party, and they have been particularly active in building links with other youth wings from other PRR parties from Europe, but also from Israel and India. So this is for what concerns the architects of the transnationalization. Now, when all these actors from all over the world meet together, what do they talk about? What are they mobilizing issues? So as mentioned, we collected some text data from their speeches at these events. And here, just to give you an idea of the geographical representation, I put a map in which you can see the countries represented in the dataset by number of speeches. And as you can see, there are a lot of speeches from the United States, there are a lot from Western and Eastern Europe, but actually also the South American continent is well represented. So here from Brazil, we have mainly speeches from the Bolsonaros, and in particular from Eduardo, who has been very active in this front. But as you can see, we have Argentina, we have Chile, we have Peru. There are quite a lot of countries that attend this event. So, what do they talk about? Here, you can see in the slide the keywords that our models identify as constituting distinct topics that are addressed during these events, right? And as you would expect, a lot of what they talk about are traditional populist radical right topics, so those that are really related to the nativist and populist ideology of these parties. So we have opposition to immigration, especially if it is, Islamic immigration or immigration from Africa. We have the idea of a Western Judeo-Christian civilization, which is under threat from communism, from Muslim terrorism, and so on. In a very populist fashion, we have Euroscepticism, which is the opposition to the process of the European Union integration. And we also have sovereignism, so this idea of the defense of national sovereignty against the European Union multilateral mode of governance. So these are kind of the usual suspects, right? We would expect them to talk about this stuff. But they actually address a much wider range of issues. So we also find topics like conservatism, religion and family, which are certainly related to the populist radical right, but they are not at its ideological core. And we also find issues that we usually would not associate with this party family, like, for example, foreign policy and security. As you can see, it mainly addresses Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we also find the competition from China in there, then US politics and the economy. So issues around trade, market, job growth, and so on. So they actually address a wide range of topics, but the salience of these topics depends on which kind of transnational events we are looking at. So here in the slide, you can see the salience, the presence of these topics by type of event. And in dark blue, you see the traditional radical right topics, whereas in light blue, you see the newer topics, if you like. And what this slide tells us is basically that there is a spectrum. And on the one extreme, we find the events in the context of the European Parliament, so ENF or ID, in which traditional topics are the most prominent, right? You see them in the top left, in the top right, sovereignism, opposition to immigration, Euroscepticism. These really are the usual suspect of the populist radical right in Europe. And on the other extreme, we find CPAC events on the top left. So there, actually, radical right party actors discuss newer issues like US politics, the conservative ideology, religion and family. And the Viva festivals organized by Vox and the National Conservatism conferences sit between these two extremes, right? So Viva, again, we find quite some prominence of traditional topics like opposition to immigration, Western civilization. Topic is religion and family. The NatCon conferences, again, quite a balance, but their most debated topic is actually foreign policy and security. Now, given that we have collected data for quite a wide time frame, we can also see whether the salience of these topics has varied over time for the populist radical right transnationalization. So here in the graph, you can see a panel for each topic, and on the x-axis x-axis, you can see the year in which the event was held, whereas in the y-axis, you can see the expected topic proportion. So just to give you an example, unfortunately, this doesn't work, but opposition to immigration on the top left, you see at the beginning of the graph, it's about 0.3%, right? That means that 30% of the content of the speeches in 2013 were about opposition to immigration. Now, the main takeaway from this study is that opposition to immigration, which is really the ideological core of the populist radical right, or at least it has been for many years when the radical right was mostly a European matter, its salience has decreased considerably over time. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not against immigration anymore, that's obviously not the case, but at least when it comes to the transnational dimension of the right, this is not as relevant as it was in the past. The same goes for sovereignism, which is there in the middle at the bottom. And this was at the advantage of newer topics, like we see religion and family on the top right, of this idea of a Western civilization of US politics. And this is probably a reflection of the fact that, it is not just European politicians meeting at this kind of events, but we increasingly see US Republicans, we increasingly see politicians from Latin America. So the topics are changing over time. And of course, the salience of the topics also reflects external events. So the most evident case here is foreign policy and security. As you can see, it records a spike around 2022, and that's because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And interestingly, given that these parties are becoming parties of government, or at the very least they are gaining increasing seats in parliament, the economy still remains a relatively marginal topic. Although, as you can see, it has been increasing since 2022, and I would expect that as we have even more Latin American speakers at this kind of event, is going to become more prominent, because the economy is much more an issue for the populist radical right in Latin America than it is for the Europeans, for example. Now, as mentioned, we were also interested in whether we can talk about a global, transnational, radical right discourse. So if I go to CPAC as opposed to a Viva festival, and I hear people talking about the conservative ideology, for example, do they talk about the same things? Do they use the same frames, the same narratives? And we find that this is pretty much the case. So here I'm going to give you two examples. The first one relates to conservative ideology. So speeches which address these topics, usually, they talk about the foundational principles of conservatism, which are God, family, and the nation. But these politicians have also been trying to discuss how to make the conservative ideology a successful one. And a lot of them, like Eduardo Bolsonaro here, recognize that we conservatives do not have that many opportunities to debate in mainstream media. Sometimes it's even hard to get inside of universities. So the idea here is that conservatives are not that successful because they do not have access to key cultural institutions to the same extent that the left does, right? And this was a belief that was very widespread, so much so that then we find a quote from Ram Madhav, who is an Indian politician, is the general secretary of the Indian Radical Right Party, the Bharatiya Janata Party. And he was explaining 2 years later and asking in Washington how after they won with a landslide majority the election in 2014, what they did was using this conservative consensus to take back everything that liberals took away from us. We reclaimed our universities and academic bodies. We took back the media space. So you can see how, although we're talking about politicians really coming from very distinct social, cultural, political contexts, they are using the same tropes. They think that the strategy for conservatism, not only to win, but also to try to sustain those victories, is actually to access those kind of perceivably left-wing dominated spaces. Another example that I'm gonna give you concerns religion and family. So here the idea is that, those principles that I was talking about of Western civilization, so God, the nation, the family, are under threat by the globalists, by left-wing elites. So, for instance, I have a quote by Josh Hawley, a US Republican, again a NatCon, who was saying, "The left preaches its own gospel, a creed of intersectionality, of deliverance from tradition, from family, from biological sex, and of course from God. Instead of Christmas, they want Pride Month. Instead of prayers in schools, they venerate the trans flag. Diversity, equity, and inclusions are their watchwords, their new holy trinity." So, gender ideology, critical race theory are blamed, basically, for the dismantling of Western civilization. This is a narrative that also Jair Bolsonaro has used here against the left. And yeah, the idea, as you can see also from the second quote, which is from a Slovak politician, is that all these ideologies want to destroy the Western civilization, okay? So we can see how the attacks against religion and the family in the views of these politicians are intrinsically linked to social developments towards gender equality, towards better rights for women and LGBTQ plus people. But the point here is that we see the emergence of a global radical right discourse. It doesn't matter if we're looking at politicians from Latin America, from Europe, from the States. It doesn't matter which type of events we're looking at, they adopt the same narratives, the same frames. So I'm now gonna hand it over to Duncan again, who is gonna discuss the drivers of transnational engagement.
Thanks. So, a third research question was why? Why are radical right politicians and parties from Europe, from across the world, increasingly cooperating with one another? And this part of the presentation we base particularly on the interviews that we've conducted in various countries over the last few years, particularly though with some of those main architects of transnationalization, so people in Hungary, the United States, Spain, and also in Italy, which has been probably if we were to have put the top 4 architects, Italy would have been a number. Now, there's one obvious answer you might have of why are they cooperating so much now as well. They're more successful now, they're more respected in the parties of government. Their message hasn't changed, but their support levels have, and that's certainly one factor. But there are others that really came through in our interviews. I'm going to talk about 3. The first one is, no matter who we spoke to, we tended to get the line that we face transnational challenges which required a transnational response. And they at least claim that this is something new. So for example, the first quote on the screen you see there is from a guy called Mike Gonzalez, who works for the Heritage Foundation in the United States, which you may well have heard of, the people behind Project 2025. We spoke to Gonzalez in Washington a couple of years ago. He's a regular at things like CPAC and also Spanish language events like Fora Madrid, because he speaks English and Spanish. And he put it very simply. He said, look, once upon a time, conservatives, they always call themselves conservatives. They don't like the term radical right.
Reactionary.
Yeah. They put themselves as conservative. They say, well, look, we were always just interested in what was going on in our own nations. We didn't have this kind of internationalist view of the left. We just wanted to mind our own business kind of idea. We were never interested in transnational alliances, but now we're facing a common enemy. And there's nothing like a common enemy to concentrate on mind. And we got a very similar line from Jorge Martín Frias, who's a member of the European Parliament for Vox in Spain, but probably more importantly, the director of Disenso, their think tank, which has really been the key force behind bringing Forum Madrid together. When Frias told us in Madrid last year, he said, look, there's a global agenda of the left and progressives, liberals, and so on, and that agenda will either get a global response from the right or to succeed. Again, very similar thing we were told by Martin Weiss from Fidesz. If we want to save the values we hold dear and not let them be rewritten, we have to cooperate. And this brings me to a point I want to make about their ideology. So at the beginning, I think on my second slide, we talked about who are these people, what do they stand for? And traditionally the idea was always the people versus elites and dangerous others. And it was very much a nationally conceived idea, right? But I think we can now speak of a transnational populist radical right ideology. It doesn't substitute the first one. They're still interested in defending the Hungarians, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Brazilians. But they don't just see the people as being national. They also see the people at the same time as being transnational, which could be Western, could be Judeo-Christian. And they see that transnational people as being under threat from not just a national elite in your individual capital or your national media, but from a transnational, bad, corrupt elite, which can be best put under the headline, which word I think Bolsonaro used to love as well, globalists. And they all talk about globalists, whether you're talking to people in Europe or North America or South America, it's the globalists. It's this idea that there's an elite cabal of international progressives who want to make everyone the same. And the others too, the third building block of their ideology, also has a transnational dimension now. It's not just immigrants coming to a single country, it's the idea of Muslims are coming and they want to replace Christian traditions in various countries. Or it's the great replacement theory, this idea that people of colour, for example, are being brought in by the left in order to supplant the native Christian, usually people, and also to gain votes from them. That's a typical trope you find. So that's developed in parallel to the national populist radical right ideology. The second main reason we get when we talk to them is radical right populists are convinced, I'm not sure that they're right, but they're convinced that the left works together very well internationally. Now, I think that's news to a lot of people on the left, but the right believes this. They really do. You get it from everyone you talk to. They say, no, previously they had the Communist International, now they've got George Soros and Open Society foundations. They do this stuff really well, we do it badly, we need to catch up. And you can see this exemplified in the quote on the screen. It's from Gavin Wax, one of the US Young Republicans, who's been very active in bringing youth wings together from across the world. And he says, look, we're replicating strategy that's been very effective on the left, allows their movements to be more potent politically in ideology because they learn from each other, they implement similar tactics politically and similar ideological narratives across country lines. Their narrative is the left has always been internationalist and very good at this, and we need to catch up. As I say, it's probably news to a lot of people on the left. But they believe it. The third main reason is they think this stuff has benefits. It's not just about going to CPAC and having a few free drinks and a nice meal and seeing a new city. There's substance to this. There are benefits, both short-term and long-term. They say we learn about policies, for example, that our partners who might be in government are introducing. For example, in the United States and in other parts of Europe, they all talk about, in Hungary, they've got this policy to try and encourage Hungarians to have more children. It's been an absolute disaster, but they're convinced that it's worth trying. And they all talk to us about that. The first quote you see on the screen exemplifies this from a guy called Daniele Scalea, who's the president of the Centro Machiavelli, the Machiavelli Centre in Italy, which is very close to the League, an Italian radical right party. that we find examples of best practices that we do not have here when we go to meet other radical right populists. So we go to learn and replicate things here in Italy, where of course they're now in government. There's also the more long-term view for some parties that aren't so close to power yet, that if they can learn things now, that in the future they'll be able to do, so they'll be better when they get into government. The second quote you see from Frias, from Vox and Disenso, he says, look, we go to these meetings, we exchange experiences with more successful radical right parties, because then when we come to power, we'll be able to change things more quickly. We won't make some of the same mistakes. And finally, there's also, in terms of the benefit, there's a socialization process going here. And it's not just about the next election or the next government. It's about the next generation. You remember at the start, for example, I showed you the slide about the youth wings, which are meeting very regularly, and there's all sorts of workshops for them beyond that, organized by think tanks and parties. The last quote you see on the screen is from a guy called Mark Ivano, who runs an association called Republicans for National Renewal, which is a US Republican organization that its main focus is bringing together young people from the radical right, young elites from the radical right. As he said to us when we interviewed him, he said, look, we invest in them because in 5-10 years, they're going to be the members of parliament. And Joao mentioned at the beginning, myself and Sofia and Cas Mudde and Ann-Cathrine Jungar and Anders Jupskas, we have a book coming out with Oxford next year on populist radical right youth wings. And we talk a lot in there about how this young elite of populist radical right activists really see themselves as being the governing far-right class of the future. And they're getting to know each other now so they can work together better tomorrow. Okay, so to conclude, what are our main takeaways? One, as I think we've shown, the transnationalization of the populist radical right has been a very significant and growing phenomenon over the last decade. As I said, 10 years ago, CPAC happened in the United States. 10 years ago, they didn't collaborate in the European Parliament. They avoided each other. Sometimes they didn't even want to be in the same photograph together. They positioned themselves in different parts of the Parliament, so journalists couldn't even photograph them together. Now they take selfies on stages of each other. They organize events. There's a significant networking and socialization process occurring. As Sofia discussed, their discourse has gained global character. They have clear shared understanding of basic issues. And finally, as I said, it's not just, however, about these big events, and it's not just about the short term. It's not about tomorrow's newspaper headline. This is, and it comes through very clearly when we talk to them, they see this as a long-term, ongoing project. It's about developing future generations of transnationalized populist radical right politicians. So, with obvious implications for liberal democracy if they succeed. That's all from us. Thank you.
Share the table. A gente vai abrir para perguntas da plateia. Se vocês quiserem perguntar em português, eu posso traduzir também. Fique à vontade. Pode perguntar, né?
Thanks for your presentation. I found very interesting. So, I'm a master's student here at IESP, and I'm researching international networks of climate obstruction here in Brazil. So how companies, politicians, like public people would connect to block or delay the climate agenda here. And I would like to ask, like, if you've seen something about climate change in these discourses, like, was it a relevant topic? And I would also really appreciate, like, insights on pathways of investigations. So where to look at, I'm already investigating, like, CPACs, the work of like international think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, etc. But like if you have insight on some places where besides that to look, I would really appreciate it.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm doing my doctorship here, And I have a very simple question, because when you talked about the architects, you didn't mention Latin America, and so I would like to ask if you have any idea of whom would be these architects in Latin America, especially in Brazil or Argentina, two places where I have a lot of interest.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And, but I didn't hear anything about money. Who's financing all these?
Okay, let's take 3 questions first, and then we can open again for other questions. Is that all right?
Yeah.
I can take
Literally, right?
I can take the climate change and a bit of architecture.
go for
We have something to ask. So thank you for your questions. Yes, definitely climate change is there. I think so far it is featuring more in terms of the topic about the economy. But yeah, they're certainly talking, criticizing green measures, for example, for instance, in the context of the European Parliament, in which that kind of stuff is legislated from above by the EU and so on. So Santiago Abascal is always banging on about the Green Deal, for example, which is this set of legislations that the member states should implement. Between Spain and Latin America, there is the defense of the farmers, for example, and the fact that these measures for these too much attentions about, CO2 emissions and things like that will damage farmers. So it's definitely there, and it is increasingly an issue that the radical right is addressing transatlantically, for sure. Yeah. And
Did you want to do some of the architects Latin America?
yeah, I would say for Brazil is certainly Eduardo Bolsonaro more than anyone else. So yeah, and it has been like this for years. He has met quite a long time ago with Frias, Herman Tech, whom we interview.
Eduardo Bolsonaro is one of, I think, 5 or 6 people who's been to every single CPAC Hungary.
Yeah. So it's certainly the most active, obviously, has been at CPAC US. But yeah, I would say that he has built contacts with Vox and the Fundación Disenso quite some time ago. But then, he also met with politicians from the AFD after that. So,
And the US, they love
Yeah. So it's certainly the main one here, I would say.
But there's other people as well. So we're going to Brasilia tomorrow, and we're interviewing via Kisis,
That's right.
who's been another figure who's tried to be active in terms of the transnational scene. The question is who's financing this? Look to Hungary. Hungary finances an awful amount of this, and we didn't talk really in the presentation about it, but for example, one of the things that a lot of radical right parties say that they can learn about Hungary is the way that Orbán, in the 15 years he's been in power, has created what, and I'm using their words, has created an ecosystem to support Fidesz in power. And part of that ecosystem is a range of think tanks which are officially independent, but are totally financed, 100% financed by the Hungarian government. It's not just the Centre for Fundamental Rights that we mentioned, it's they have 2 universities, the Matthias Corvus, and they've got another one. And they are funneling very serious amounts of money from the Hungarian government into these kind of organizations which are really trying to promote the transnational links. And that's the transnational side of things has been especially since 2021. And there's reasons for that as well. It's to do with Hungary's shift from being, they used to try to be seen in the European Parliament as being with the Christian Democrats, and then the Christian Democrats eventually kicked them out, and that's when they totally embraced this mission. But in terms of where the money's coming from, a lot of it comes from there in terms of financing events and bringing people there. And you can get it, when you go to Budapest like we did, you can also find a lot of random Western European and United States intellectuals there on the dime of the Hungarian government with very nice well-paid jobs in think tanks and university-type institutions there. Parts of the United States are, for example, part of the US Republican ecosystem as well. I mean, the organization we just talked about, Republicans for National Renewal, that's what they call it, a PAC, where people can contribute to it. So they get donors contributing to them. So, and then the other part of the story, of course, is that there's actually a lot of money from the European Parliament for its groups to organize activities. It's one of the, I think, very egalitarian but paradoxical things of the European Parliament is that it funds the people who would like to destroy it.
Yeah.
And they do. So the groups, if you got the numbers, which the far right does now, to create groups, they can access a lot of money for social type events from the European Parliament. So yeah, they would be the main sources of the cash.
What about the United States?
But the United States, in terms of the Republican Party financing organizations like Republicans for National Renewal, yes, that is another source of money.
Atlas Network, no?
Sorry? Oh, Atlas as well. Yeah, Atlas has come up in conversations with. When I've talked to like activists from the left, like from say the Progressive Foundation, they talk a lot about Atlas, but we've never heard of Atlas when we've talked to far right people. Maybe there's a reason for that.
Maybe they don't want to tell us.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
Leaving behind.
Yeah.
And you done with the answers? More questions.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm a PhD student here, and it's my first year, but I'm starting to develop a research trying to understand these frames and cultural aspects that unite a right-wing group in Brazil. So it was really enlightening, the presentation. Thanks. I was wondering, because you talked about the shift between like non-cooperation and cooperation, and I was thinking perhaps there was an event or something that happened that drive this shift, and maybe when this shift, I think you mentioned 2021, I don't know if there was the case of a year that there was this shift. And I was thinking about the time frame. You showed it was your data was from 2014 and 2024. I was wondering if it was like when these events started to become active and why this was the time frame. Thank you.
So first, thanks for the presentation, and I would like to ask about if you could offer some insights on the role of non-Western people within this transnational populist network. I mean, there are still tensions motivated by racism, by xenophobia, or could you perceive a kind of, let's say, trans-civilizational solidarity merging with people, as said, from India, from Japan, who participate in these conferences within these groups?
Anybody else? Go ahead.
So here in South America, we see this sort of movement where, like recently in our independence holiday, we saw a big US flag. So here in South America, we see this movement where they praise a lot the US. They see them as their hero. You have Milei almost crying, seeing Trump for the first time, like it was a god or something like that. So I was thinking about how those movements see this sort of subservience to the US as the main character of the Western, because I imagine they had different views of who's the Western leader, just like in Europe or the US, like, and just take the points of views of different actors in that sense.
Anyone else? I want to ask a question. No, I mean, I was sitting there listening to the presentation. I was thinking, what are these meetings? More than how do they exceed? The mere like exchanging of experiences, photo ops. I mean, creation of content for social media, and shooting the breeze. I mean, how they go beyond that. And because and I tell you what I missed in the. I think you did a great job, describing what's going on. It's really interesting, but it seems to me that it never got to the point of discussing like the good old international relations, national interests, old realism. Where is that? Because these guys seem to stay on the realm of culture, of the cultural revolution of the right. So where are like topics related to good old international politics? Do they get into that? Because this is kind of paradoxical for them too, as a matter of fact, right? I would think, right? Because other than that, I mean, the pictures you showed to us, it looks like some sort of think tank event also, right? Or some sort of Comic-Con and Vivo. I don't know how to describe that. But it didn't look like a sturdy conference of people who actually are in charge of countries discussing, actual interests of these countries, besides the cultural revolution part.
Yeah.
That's it. Go ahead.
Okay.
I can start with the time frame. I don't know if you want to say something about the shift, and I can take the non-Western people one.
Yeah, I can do the subservience US.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, in terms of the time frame, it starts from 2013 because in that year there was the first, we could say, of these transnational events, which wasn't even a transnational event. It was actually a party congress of the Italian Radical Right Party, the League. And for the first time, Matteo Salvini, who became leader then, invited politicians from other radical right parties in Europe. So there were Austrians, French people, Flemish people, and so on. So that was really the origin, if you like, of this series of events, of the formation of then an European Parliament group, which is why it starts in 2013. So we see that at the beginning, the transnationalization mostly concerns Europe, so Western and Eastern Europe. But then in terms of the, what then boosted it after, certainly there was the victory of Donald Trump, because we just saw how, in theory, mainstream parties and the leader of democracy around the world actually shared the populist radical right ideology that provide a massive boost for the legitimacy of these parties also in Europe. Even in Europe, they increasingly enter government, and again, when you win elections, that gives you legitimacy too. So those certainly were drivers of the shift from non-cooperation to cooperation. You want to add anything on this?
I think you covered it. Before 2014 in the European Parliament, there'd never been a single ideologically homogenous radical right group. And that's what I wrote about in the book, International Populism, how that came about. It came about a lot from the agency of Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. They basically, I know that I spoke to people who were quite close to them, they got together in a Paris restaurant in 2013 and they sorted out their differences, because before then Wilders had been telling people, I have nothing to do with Le Pen, just like Viktor Orban. That's obviously changed hugely. And then, it's grown from there as the experience. A lot of people expect, that kind of alliance to break apart very quickly, like any previous attempts between nationalists in Europe have broken apart. But it didn't, it held. I remember I was interviewing them in 2014 and 2015, and they were very clear, no, this time we're going to be serious about it, and we're going to play nice. And it's not just about the next 3 or 4 years even, it's about a long-term thing. So that's the reason for the time frame.
Well, what holds them together? Common enemy?
So, they also have a lot of issues in common as well. I mean, that kind of gets to, I was going to get to that with your question. I mean, for obvious reasons, they tend to play down the issues that divide them. I mean, the reason they don't talk so much about the kind of politics you were talking about is because they're divided on that. Don't get them talking about Russia. It's going to finish very badly. You get a Pole and a Hungarian discussing that one. No, very different views. So, and I think that's what the sort of the maturing process, if we can call it that, of the radical right, has also been to realize, what, we've got differences, but we're going to put them to one side. We're going to focus on anti-immigration. We're going to focus on new issues like gender. We're going to focus on the things that unite us. And the others, for example, they often disagree on the economy. Some of them are quite protectionist, others are much more neoliberal. They just don't talk about it. That's the solution. And like in any relationship, when you don't disagree on something, maybe you shouldn't talk about it. So I think there is a bit of that. Do you want to go to the role of the non-Western people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I would say no. I didn't find any sort of global South solidarity, for example, or two kind of global North versus global South blocks. What you see is this construction of a Judeo-Christian civilization, and that is something that also Bolsonaro has embraced, like he has talked about this stuff. So that will, put together anything from Chile to Israel and Europe and the United States, and that has become the new people.
Bizarro bricks.
Yeah, right? And what is interesting, though, I can talk for the case of India because it's the one that I know best. But for instance, Ram Madhav, the General Secretary from India, in that speech about the conservative ideology, obviously the Indians cannot claim themselves that they are Judeo-Christians or so on, but there the umbrella will be, we are the conservatives. But he was saying, look, we disagree about some stuff. So for example, climate change, they were like, no, we as Indians are very serious about climate change and we know that you're not. But yeah, then it's a matter of, we're not going to talk about that, but just so you know, we think it's mad what you believe about climate change, okay? So I think these are the two kind of solidarities that are built and that can unite global North and global South. One is the Judeo-Christian identity, and one is just the conservatives' identity across the world.
But it's been interesting, the shift in the BJP. I remember in 2016, I was in Delhi. I interviewed a bunch of BJP senior people for an article that came out then in Democratization. And when I would just ask, the interviews were about very different things to what we're talking about today, but just chatting to them at the end, I would often say, what parties do you see yourself as similar to elsewhere? And they would either say none, we're special, or they would say the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives. When I would maybe push a little bit to say, what about a party like Marine Le Pen's or Geert Wilders? They'd be like, absolutely not. And now that's completely changed. Now they're happy to share a stage at events like NatCon or some of the youth wing events, these people. So there's also been an embracing of cooperation by the BJP.
Yeah. They were happy to accept members of the European Parliament from these parties when, they annexed Kashmir in, 2019?
2019.
So,
Modi invited a group of far-right MEPs in the European Parliament to come when nobody else could get into Kashmir, to go into Kashmir and say, yes, everything's fine.
Democracy is working.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You want to go ahead?
Or is it subservience to the US? Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Because for some of these parties, particularly in Western Europe, the French are a classic example, there's a long-standing anti-US feeling there. And Marine Le Pen, certainly at the beginning, was not keen to be associated with Donald Trump. And one of the things that has annoyed me most in the media over the last 5-6 years are these people who go on about Steve Bannon as being this somehow evil genius who's...
They didn't like it.
No, not particularly. I mean, Bannon came to Europe and said in 2019, said, hey, I'm going to organize you in this thing called the movement. And they said, we don't need to be organized, we've got a group, go away. And that was also because, you know, and the AfD in Germany said this very clearly too. They said, it's not a great look for German nationalists to be organized by an American. Thank you, you know, out. So that is still certainly there. But again, it goes back to what we were just saying before. It's something that now they're more able to put to one side. So, you know, they're still happy to go to events and talk about what they do have in common. But, you know, don't get them talking about military things, much less the economy. But yeah, it brings to the final question about, you know, beyond the shooting the breeze at CPAC and so on. I mean, yeah, they talk about foreign policy a little bit, but they try to avoid talking about it too much because it's so divisive. Just like the economy could be divisive too. But there is, I mean, I think one point I do want to stress here, there is also a lot of substance to this cooperation. It's not just the nice weekend in Budapest. Below the surface, there's a whole range of workshops, of regular contacts, of youth wings organizing what they call summer universities, where they bring all these people, young people together and do courses for them, and then they go out and drink in the evening and so on. There is a lot of activity going on there. I mean, in some ways, you know, they don't have a single entity which we could call the Radical Right International, but in terms of the quantity and quality of activities they've got going on, they do.
And to add something on that, for instance, when I was talking about the conservative ideology and how to make it successful, right? Viktor Orban had this idea that you can't just, you know, win an election every now and then, but you need to have an architecture, meaning think tanks, universities, things like that push conservatism in society, right? So now, Eduardo Bolsonaro, after having, you know, his talks with Vox is very close to Fidesz and so on, he has founded the Liberal Conservative Institute, for example, which is a think tank now. He has also founded kind of a right-wing university called Prepara Brasil. Now, I don't know what they're gonna do with it, but you see how they're copying each other. Like, I doubt that Eduardo Bolsonaro all of a sudden decided, hold on a second, we're missing a think tank here, right? But it's obviously something that they're learning from one another. So perhaps, sure, they still do not have a united front in foreign policy, but they are kind of learning from one another ways in which they can certainly affect their domestic politics.
Any other questions? Any other comments from you guys? No?
I think we're good.
So, thank you so much for coming
Yeah.
here.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank
And you guys made some of these, right?
We haven't